I don't know if it was just bad luck or poor judgment that got me into trouble that summer. It was 2018, and I had planned a solo camping trip through France, something I'd been wanting to do for years. I was 28, in decent shape, and confident in my ability to handle myself outdoors. I had camped plenty of times before, though mostly in designated spots, nothing too remote. But this time, I wanted something different. I wanted to get away from the crowded sites filled with families and retirees in camper vans. I had a route planned, starting from the northeast and working my way down. But I never made it past the first stop. I had set my sights on a small camping area in the Auvergne region. It was tucked away in the forests near a lake, not too far from a village. The place had good reviews online. Quiet, scenic, and peaceful. Exactly what I was looking for. The drive was straightforward until I reached the last stretch. A sign pointed left for the official campsite, but my GPS kept telling me to take a narrow dirt road off to the right. I hesitated. It looked more like a maintenance path than a road, but I figured maybe it was a back entrance or a shortcut. I followed it, expecting it to merge with the main road again. Didn't. The further I went, the rougher it got. The trees pressed in from both sides, their branches scraping against my car. The road was full of potholes, and after about 15 minutes of driving at a crawl, I realized I had made a mistake. There was no way this led to the campsite. I decided to turn back, but that's when I saw a clearing up ahead. A wide, open space surrounded by dense forest with a fire pit in the middle. It looked like an unofficial camping spot. It wasn't what I had planned, but by then, I was tired. The sun was already low in the sky, and I didn't want to risk damaging my car on the way out. I could just camp here for the night and find my way back in the morning. The place was quiet, too quiet. No birds, no insects, just the rustling of leaves. The air felt heavy, like it does before a storm, though the sky was clear. I set up my tent quickly, trying to shake the strange feeling creeping over me. I built a small fire and ate a quick meal. As the light faded, I realized something else. There was no sign that anyone had used this spot recently. The fire pit was cold, no trash, no tire tracks. Just an empty, forgotten space in the woods. I told myself that was a good thing. No other campers meant no noisy neighbors. But the silence was unsettling. I forced myself to relax, stretching out in my sleeping bag, listening to the crackle of the fire outside. I told myself I was overthinking it. I was alone. There was nothing to be afraid of. Then, just as I started to drift off, I heard it. A sound, faint but clear. Twigs snapping. Something moving just beyond the firelight. I held my breath, listening. The fire was burning low now, casting flickering shadows on the trees. I waited, my heart pounding. Could have been an animal, a deer maybe, but something felt off. The sound stopped. Silence. I exhaled slowly, trying to stay calm. Maybe it was just my imagination. I was in an unfamiliar place, alone in the dark. My mind was playing tricks on me. I turned onto my side, pulling my sleeping bag up, and closed my eyes again. More snapping. Closer this time. My eyes shot open. I sat up, my pulse hammering in my ears. I reached for my flashlight and aimed it toward the sound. The beam cut through the darkness, landing on trees, bushes, empty space. Nothing, but I knew something was there. I waited, scanning the trees, but whatever it was had gone still. I told myself to stay rational. Could have been a fox or a boar. Wild animals weren't uncommon. I wasn't in any danger. As long as I kept my food sealed, they wouldn't bother me. But I wasn't convinced. I let the fire burn a little longer before finally forcing myself to lie back down. I kept my knife close and my flashlight within reach. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a restless sleep. A noise pulled me from my dreams. Soft, slow, footsteps on dirt. I froze, my pulse hammering. They weren't coming from the trees. They were inside my campsite. I lay completely still, barely breathing. The fire had burned down to embers, and my tent was zipped shut. I was blind to whatever was outside. The footsteps moved closer. Whoever it was, they were circling my tent. I gripped my knife so tightly my hand ached. I was trapped, If I unzipped the tent, I'd be exposed. If I stayed inside, I had no idea what they might do. The footsteps stopped right next to my head. Silence. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and burnt wood. Then something brushed against the tent fabric. Not an animal, a hand. I stopped breathing. A long, slow drag of fingers across the nylon. Deliberate, testing. I swallowed hard, trying to think. If I made a sound, would it scare them off? Or would it make things worse? I tightened my grip on the knife. If they tried to come in, I would fight. I had no other choice. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Silence. Minutes passed. I didn't move. Then, finally, footsteps. Retreating, fading into the trees. I stayed awake the rest of the night, knife in hand, waiting for them to come back. They didn't. At the first light of dawn, I crawled out of the tent, my whole body stiff with fear. The fire pit was nothing but ashes now, and the air was thick with the scent of morning dew. I looked around, searching for footprints. The ground was disturbed, but not enough to give me a clear idea of what or who had been there. I packed up as fast as I could, my hands shaking. The drive back was rough. My tires skidded on the damp earth, branches scraped against the doors, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get out. When I finally reached the main road, I pulled over, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. I forced myself to breathe, to think. Who had been out there? And more importantly, how long had they been watching me? I drove straight to the nearest town, found a cafe, and sat there for over an hour, trying to calm down. I didn't tell anyone what had happened. I never went back to that campsite. I don't even know if I could find it again. And I don't want to. It had been raining since midday. Not the light kind of rain that you could ignore, but a steady, heavy downfall that soaked through clothes, turned dirt to mud, and made everything feel colder than it really was. I was miles deep in the woods, far from the main road, alone with nothing but my tent, my gear, and the sound of rain hammering down on the trees above. I had planned this camping trip for a while. After weeks of being stuck inside, dealing with work, and barely getting any fresh air, I just wanted to get out into the wild, away from everything. The forecast had called for some rain, but I hadn't expected it to last this long or come down this hard. I had set up camp earlier in the afternoon when the rain had just started, picking a relatively dry patch of ground between two large trees. My tent was small but sturdy, my sleeping bag thick enough to keep the cold away, and my gear was packed in waterproof bags. By the time night started creeping in, the temperature had dropped. The rain had soaked the forest floor, and a thin mist had started forming between the trees. I sat in my tent with my small lantern on, eating a cold meal out of a can, listening to the rain. It was peaceful at first, just the rhythmic sound of water hitting the tent, the distant creaks of tree branches, the occasional rustling in the undergrowth, the kind of quiet that makes you feel completely alone. But then, something changed. It was subtle at first, a shift in the atmosphere, a feeling that I wasn't as alone as I had thought. The sound of the rain had masked everything else, but as I sat there, I started noticing something different, something moving beyond the usual noises of the forest. It was faint, almost blending with the rain, but there was a pattern to it, a crunching sound, footsteps. I held my breath, listening. The rain had softened the ground, but whatever was moving out there was heavy enough to make noise. It wasn't an animal, at least not a small one. It was deliberate, slow, like someone walking carefully through the woods. I reached for my flashlight, turning off the lantern so I wouldn't be visible from the outside. The inside of the tent went dark instantly, and I felt my heartbeat in my ears. The footsteps continued, stopping and starting again, closer now. I slowly unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The rain had let up slightly, but the forest was still dark, shadows stretching between the trees. I scanned the area, moving the flashlight carefully. Nothing. No movement, no sign of anything unusual. Just trees, wet ground, and mist curling through the undergrowth. but I knew I wasn't imagining it. I sat there for what felt like an hour, my back against the tent wall, flashlight gripped in my hand. The footsteps had stopped, but that didn't mean whoever or whatever had been out there was gone. The rain picked up again, masking any other sounds, making it impossible to tell if something was moving just beyond my line of sight. Eventually, exhaustion started to take over. I lay down, fully clothed, my flashlight within reach, listening. The rain, the wind, the distant rustling. Nothing else. At some point, I must have dozed off. I woke up suddenly. Something was outside my tent. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The rain had lightened, and through the thin fabric of the tent, I could hear its slow, deliberate movement. Someone was standing just outside. I could hear the weight shift in the mud, the quiet inhale of breath. Not an animal, not the wind. Someone. I felt a wave of cold fear rush through me. I wasn't near any trails. No one else should be out here. I reached for the knife I kept with my gear, gripping it tightly. I stayed completely still, waiting, listening. The figure outside wasn't moving anymore, just standing there, watching. The seconds stretched on. And then, just as quietly as it had come, it moved away. I heard the footsteps retreat, fading into the rain. I didn't move for a long time, even after I was sure they were gone. I stayed in place, gripping the knife, listening for any hint of movement. At some point, I must have drifted in and out of sleep again because the next thing I knew, it was early morning. The rain had stopped. The forest was silent. I unzipped the tent slowly, stepping outside into the damp morning air. The ground was muddy, puddles forming in the lower areas of the clearing. And then I saw them, footprints, not just mine. They were fresh, leading from the tree line straight to my tent, stopping just outside the entrance, and then turning back. I followed them with my eyes, tracing their path back toward the woods. They disappeared into the undergrowth, vanishing into the thick trees. Whoever had been there had stood just inches from where I had been sleeping, watching, listening. I packed my gear quickly. I didn't waste time. Whatever had happened that night, I wasn't going to wait around to find out if they would come back. As I hiked back toward my truck, the feeling of being watched never left. Even as I reached the main road, even as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere in those woods, someone had been waiting, and they had chosen to walk away, this time. I had always loved camping. It was something I did whenever I needed to clear my head, whenever life felt too busy, or when I just wanted some time away from everything. Being out in the wild with nothing but the sound of wind in the trees and the distant calls of animals always gave me a sense of peace. That's why, on a cool autumn weekend, I packed my gear and drove out to a national forest a few hours from home. I had been there before, twice actually, but this time I planned to hike deeper than I ever had. I wanted real solitude, not just the kind you find near campsites where families park their RVs. I wanted the kind where no one was around for miles. I parked my truck at a dirt pull-off where a trailhead started, slung my pack over my shoulders, and headed in. The trail was narrow, winding up through dense trees, and the deeper I went, the quieter it became. That was one thing about being out in the wilderness. At a certain point, the background hum of the world disappeared. No distant cars, no voices, no hum of electricity, just nature. I hiked for nearly 5 hours before I found a spot that felt right. It was a clearing next to a small stream, surrounded by towering pines and thick brush. The ground was flat, perfect for my tent, and the stream would be a good water source. The nearest marked trail was at least 2 miles away. I was truly alone. That night, as I sat by my fire, eating a simple meal and watching the flames dance, I felt at ease. I stared up at the sky, which was clear and filled with stars, and thought about how perfect the moment was. Then I heard something. It was faint, barely noticeable over the crackling fire, but it was there. A rustling sound. Not wind through leaves, this was different. More deliberate, like footsteps. I froze, listening. The sound stopped, I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer moving through the trees. Still, I felt uneasy. The forest suddenly felt too quiet, like it was holding its breath. I stood up, shining my flashlight into the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trunks and branches. I swept it back and forth, my heart beating a little faster. Nothing. Shaking my head, I sat back down. I was letting my imagination get to me. This was what I wanted, right? Solitude, complete isolation. Still, when I went to bed, I kept my knife close, just in case. The next morning, I woke early, feeling more rested than I expected. The night had passed without incident, and in the daylight, my nerves from the night before felt silly. I spent the day hiking further out, exploring areas of the forest that felt untouched. I saw animal tracks, heard the calls of birds, and even spotted a few deer in the distance. It was exactly what I had come for. When I returned to my campsite in the late afternoon, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There were footprints near my tent. Not mine. I could see my own prints in the dirt, leading to and from the trail I had taken earlier. But these were different, larger, heavier. Someone had been here. I felt a rush of adrenaline, scanning the area. My first thought was that a ranger had passed through, maybe checking to see if I had a permit. But no, it didn't make sense. I was too far from any marked trails. And why wouldn't they have announced themselves? I checked my gear. Nothing was missing. My food was untouched, my pack still zipped up. But the idea that someone had been standing here, near my tent, while I was gone, it sent a deep, instinctive fear through me. I considered leaving, packing up and hiking back to my truck before nightfall. But I had spent so much time getting out here, and I told myself I was overreacting. Could have been a hunter passing through. Maybe they saw my tent and left without disturbing anything. So I stayed. That night, I made my fire bigger, brighter. The glow pushed back the darkness, making me feel a little safer. But as I sat there, I kept glancing at the trees, expecting to see movement. I heard nothing, saw nothing, but I knew, deep down, that I wasn't alone. I barely slept. Every sound outside my tent made my heart race. But when morning came, everything seemed normal again. The fear felt distant, irrational, until I stepped outside. The footprints were back. More of them this time, closer to my tent. And something had been left behind. A small pile of rocks, stacked neatly, right in front of my tent's entrance. I stared at it, my skin crawling. Someone had come right up to my tent while I was sleeping. Someone had stood just inches away from where I lay, completely unaware. I didn't hesitate this time. I packed up as fast as I could, stuffing everything into my backpack, not even bothering to eat breakfast. I just wanted to get out. As I started hiking back, I felt watched. Every few minutes, I glanced over my shoulder. The trees seemed denser than before, the shadows darker. I walked fast, my heart pounding. Then I saw it. A man, standing just off the trail, partially hidden by trees. He was dressed in dark clothing, his face obscured by the shadows. He didn't move, didn't call out, just stood there. I didn't stop, didn't run either. I just kept moving, forcing myself not to panic. I walked for hours, pushing myself to the limit. By the time I reached my truck, my legs were shaking. I tossed my gear in the back, jumped in, and locked the doors. As I started the engine, I looked back at the trailhead. He was there, standing at the edge of the trees, watching me. I didn't stay to get a better look. I floored it, speeding down the dirt road, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I didn't stop until I was back on the main road, miles away from that forest. I never went camping alone again. I have always liked the outdoors. Growing up, my dad used to take me camping and hunting, and it became something I kept doing well into adulthood. I liked the isolation, the quiet, and the way the air smelled in the middle of nowhere. The further away from people, the better. It was just me, the woods, and the sound of wind moving through the trees. I thought I knew what to expect when I went out there. But there was one trip that changed everything for me. It happened a few years ago, back when I was still living in Montana. I had taken a week off from work and decided to go deep into the mountains, deeper than I had ever gone before. I wanted complete solitude. No roads, no people, just me and the wild. I packed enough supplies for a full week. Food, water, my rifle, my knife, my tent, everything I would need. The hike took most of the day. I had a GPS with me, but I also trusted my map and compass more. The further I walked, the more I could feel myself sinking into that quiet, detached state I always got when I was out in nature for a while. The sun was getting lower when I finally found a good spot. High ground, flat, not too many trees blocking the view. I set up my tent, got a small fire going, and ate some jerky while listening to the sounds of the forest. Everything felt normal. The first night was fine. I woke up to the sound of something moving outside my tent, but that wasn't unusual. Could have been a deer, maybe a fox, maybe even a bear. I kept my rifle close and went back to sleep. The second day, I spent my time hiking around, gathering wood, and making sure my camp was in good shape. The whole time, I felt like I was being watched. Not in a paranoid way, not like something was directly staring at me, but just an odd sense that I wasn't as alone as I thought. I've had that feeling before. Sometimes it's just your mind playing tricks on you. I ignored it. That night, things started getting strange. I was lying in my tent, listening to the fire crackling outside, when I heard footsteps. Heavy ones, slow and deliberate, not an animal. Animals move in bursts, fast and erratic. This was something moving with purpose, like it knew exactly where it was going. I grabbed my rifle and listened. The footsteps circled my camp. I held my breath. My heart was pounding, and I could hear blood rushing in my ears. Then they stopped. I waited. 5 minutes. 10. Nothing. I slowly unzipped the tent and peered out. The fire was still going, casting flickering shadows across the trees. But there was nothing there. I stepped out with my rifle and did a slow circle around the camp. My breath was visible in the cold night air. The fire crackled behind me. I could hear the wind moving through the trees, but nothing else. I was about to head back inside when I saw them. Footprints. Not mine. They were barefoot, human, but something was wrong. The prints were long. The toes stretched out further than they should have been, like fingers, and they didn't make sense. The stride was too wide, like whatever made them had longer legs than any person should. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I checked the area again. The prints were still there, but they didn't lead anywhere. They just stopped, like whatever had made them had vanished into thin air. I was on edge for the rest of the day. I kept my rifle with me, barely leaving camp except to gather wood. The feeling of being watched was stronger now. It wasn't my imagination. That night, I didn't even try to sleep. I sat by the fire, watching the tree line, listening. At some point, I heard something. Not footsteps this time. A voice. It came from the trees, just outside the fire's glow. It was saying my name. Not like someone calling for me. Not like someone trying to get my attention. It was flat. Wrong. Like someone was trying to copy my voice but didn't know how to use it right. I gripped my rifle so hard my knuckles went white. The voice came again, closer. Still wrong. Still broken. Then I saw it. First, I thought it was a person. Tall. Thin. Standing just outside the firelight, half hidden by the trees. But as I stared, my stomach dropped. Its legs were too long. Its arms hung too low. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, like it wasn't used to holding it upright. And its eyes, they caught the firelight like an animal's. I didn't move. It didn't move. Then it took a step forward. The moment it moved, something in me snapped. I raised my rifle and fired. The gunshot shattered the silence. The thing jerked backward, but I wasn't sure if I hit it. It didn't make a sound. No scream, no grunt, nothing. Then it turned and ran. I've never seen anything move like that. It didn't run like a person. It didn't even run like an animal. It moved on all fours, its limbs bending the wrong way, its body twisting as it shot off into the trees. I didn't stay to find out if it was coming back. I grabbed what I could, my rifle, my knife, my pack, and I ran. I left my tent, my food, everything. I ran harder than I ever had in my life. I didn't stop until the sun came up. By then, I had no idea where I was. I had my GPS, but I barely looked at it. I just kept moving, putting as much distance between me and that thing as possible. It took me 2 more days to hike back to civilization. I barely slept. I barely ate. Every time the sun went down, I found a place to hide, rifle in hand, back against a tree. When I finally made it back to my truck, I drove straight home. I never reported it. Who would believe me? Some guy in the woods seeing things after spending too much time alone? I knew what I saw, and I knew I never wanted to see it again. I haven't been back to that part of the mountains since. I still go camping, but not as deep, not as far, and never alone. Because I know now, I wasn't alone out there. Not really. And whatever was out there that night, it knew my name. I never thought I'd go back to that place alone. The last time I planned a trip there, my dog, Jake, was still alive. He was a big old Labrador mix, with a gray muzzle and slow-moving joints, but he still wagged his tail like he was a puppy when I grabbed the camping gear. That last trip never happened. He passed before we could go. It felt wrong leaving without him. But months passed, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I owed him one last trip. I packed light, a tent, my sleeping bag, some food, my knife, and a flashlight. The same things I always brought. I took the old truck out of town, following the same winding roads I'd driven with Jake 100 times before. The sky was overcast, and the radio was just a low hum under the sound of the tires on pavement. I picked a quiet spot, far enough off the main roads that I wouldn't see another soul. I wasn't worried about people. I wasn't really worried about anything. I just wanted to be out there, where the world was quiet. I wanted to sit by the fire and remember my dog. The first few hours were peaceful. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and watched the trees sway in the wind. I cooked a little, ate without much of an appetite, and let the silence settle around me. The place had always been quiet, but now it felt different. It wasn't peaceful. It was empty. As the sun dipped below the tree line, I sat by the fire and stared into the flames. Jake would have been curled up next to me, his head on his paws, his ears flicking at every little sound in the woods. I thought I heard something in the distance, a rustling, maybe a snapping branch, but I told myself it was nothing, just the wind. I wasn't new to camping. I'd spent years out in places like this, miles away from towns or highways, alone except for Jake. I knew the sounds of the woods, the groan of trees, the whisper of leaves in the wind, the distant calls of animals. I also knew when something didn't sound right. The noise came again, not the usual movement of a raccoon or a deer. This was slower, heavier. I turned my flashlight on and pointed it toward the trees. Nothing, just darkness stretching between the trunks. The fire crackled behind me, and for a second, I thought about packing up and leaving, but I stayed. Maybe it was just my head playing tricks on me. Maybe I was just feeling off because this was the first time I'd been here without Jake. I forced myself to relax, letting the fire warm my hands as the night grew colder. The wind picked up, rattling the branches overhead. I could still hear something out there, though, something moving. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I started to drift off, I'd hear it again. Something shifting in the undergrowth, something watching. By morning, I felt like hell. My back ached from sleeping on the ground. My head throbbed from the lack of sleep, and my stomach was sour from the instant coffee I choked down for breakfast. I thought about packing up, but I told myself I was overreacting. I hiked a little, following the old trails I used to walk with Jake. His absence felt heavier out there. Every time I turned a corner, I expected to see him trotting ahead, looking back to make sure I was keeping up. The woods were still, too still. Something was off. It wasn't just a feeling anymore. The birds weren't making a sound. There were no squirrels darting through the trees, no bugs buzzing in the air, just silence. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was just unsettled because I wasn't used to being out here alone. I kept walking. I found something a mile from camp. First, I thought it was a pile of branches, but as I got closer, I saw that they weren't branches at all. Bones, a lot of them, scattered in a rough circle, some snapped in half like something had bitten clean through them. I didn't recognize what they were from. Some looked too big for deer, others too small for anything else that lived in these woods. I didn't stay long. I turned around and walked back to camp, faster than before. The feeling of being watched hadn't gone away. If anything, it was stronger. By the time I got back, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I started packing, shoving everything into my bag as quickly as I could. Something snapped in the woods behind me. I stopped, turned. Nothing. The wind had died. The trees weren't moving. Then I saw it. A shape just beyond the tree line, low to the ground, watching. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a coyote. I couldn't see it clearly, but I knew it wasn't right. I grabbed my bag and moved to the truck. I didn't run. Running triggers things. Predators. I walked, steady and slow, gripping my knife so tightly my knuckles ached. I heard it following. Not close. Not yet. I reached the truck, yanked the door open, and threw my bag inside. Then I looked back. It was closer, still watching. I got in, started the engine, and hit the gas. Gravel kicked up behind me as I sped down the dirt road, glancing in the mirror every few seconds. I didn't see it anymore, but I knew it was still there. I didn't stop driving until I saw the first signs of town. Street lights, houses, people. I pulled into my driveway, killed the engine, and sat there for a long time. My hands were still shaking. My head was pounding. I never went back. Whatever was out there, it wasn't meant to be seen. I should have never gone alone. I had been camping for years, ever since I was a kid. I liked going alone, and I liked going deep into places where other people didn't bother going. The more isolated, the better. That was part of the appeal. Being away from everything, from people, from the noise. That's why I picked this spot. It was deep in the backcountry of northern Arizona, in the middle of the Coconino National Forest. Tall pines, rocky cliffs, and long, winding dirt roads that few people ever took. It was late September, which meant the nights were getting cold, but the days were still warm. Perfect weather for camping. I had driven for hours, deeper and deeper into the forest, away from the usual campsites and tourist spots. Eventually, I found a narrow trail that cut through the trees and led to a clearing just big enough to park my truck. There was no one around for miles. No tire tracks, no signs of recent activity. Just me, my gear, and the wilderness. I set up my tent a little way off from the truck, closer to a tree line where the ground was soft with pine needles. I gathered some wood for a fire, cooked a simple meal, and settled in. Felt good to be alone. The air was crisp. The only sounds were the wind moving through the trees and the occasional distant call of an animal. By the time the sun dipped below the treetops, I had everything set for the night. My tent was sturdy, my gear was organized, and the fire was crackling. I sat by the flames, eating, staring into the dark woods beyond the glow of the fire. That's when I noticed something. It was subtle at first, a slight change in the way the forest sounded. The wind was still there, but the usual rustling of small animals moving through the underbrush had stopped. No crickets, no birds, nothing. Just silence. I sat there listening. I wasn't scared, just alert. When you camp alone, you pay attention to these things. Sometimes, silence just meant a predator was nearby. A mountain lion, maybe a coyote. I wasn't worried. I had a rifle in the truck and a knife strapped to my belt. But then I heard a sound. It was faint, too faint to pinpoint. A soft, distant movement. Not the scurrying of an animal, but something else. Something deliberate. A crunch of dry leaves. A shift in the dirt. It was coming from the trees. I turned toward the sound, staring into the darkness. The firelight didn't reach far, but I could make out the shapes of trees, the uneven ground. I scanned the area, waiting, listening. Nothing. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe a branch had fallen somewhere in the distance. I turned back to the fire, but I didn't feel as relaxed as before. The feeling of being alone, the good kind, had changed. Now I felt watched. I tried to shake it off. I'd been alone in the woods 100 times before. Sometimes your mind messes with you. You start imagining things. I took a deep breath, focused on the fire, and let the warmth calm me. Then I heard it again, closer this time. A footstep, not a coyote, not a deer, a footstep. I froze, my hand gripping my knife. I turned my head slowly, scanning the tree line. The fire crackled behind me, casting shadows that danced over the ground. I didn't move. I barely even breathed. Nothing, just trees. I stood up, trying to act casual, like I was just stretching my legs. I grabbed my flashlight from the ground, clicked it on, and aimed it toward the trees. A beam of white light cut through the darkness. Nothing. I swept the beam back and forth, checking the bushes, the gaps between the trees. I held it there for a long moment, waiting. Still nothing. I let out a breath, shaking my head. Maybe an animal had been moving around and had stopped when it saw the light. Maybe it had been my own paranoia. I turned off the flashlight and sat back down, but I kept my knife in my hand. The fire burned low, and I fed it another log, watching the flames grow. The feeling of unease didn't go away, but I forced myself to relax. Then, just as I was about to turn in for the night, I heard it again. But this time, it wasn't a footstep. It was breathing. Somewhere beyond the firelight, something was breathing. Slow, steady, controlled. Not heavy like an animal. Not quick like a frightened deer. Just deep, measured breaths. I felt ice crawl up my spine. I stayed completely still, my ears straining to pinpoint the source. It was close, maybe 20 feet away, somewhere just beyond my sight. I flicked my flashlight back on and aimed it toward the sound. Nothing, but the breathing stopped. I held the beam there, my heart pounding, my grip tightening on the knife. I scanned the trees, moving the light in slow, deliberate passes. Still nothing. Then, just as I was about to turn back to the fire, I saw it. A shape, not fully visible, just at the edge of the light, half hidden behind a tree. Person, standing completely still. I didn't move, neither did they. My mind raced. There was no reason for someone to be out here. No reason for them to be standing there like that. Watching, I felt a wave of adrenaline surge through me, my instincts screaming at me to act. I gripped my knife tighter, stepped back toward my truck. If I needed to, I could grab my rifle. Then the figure moved. Not toward me, not away, just shifting like they were adjusting their stance. Still watching. My breathing was fast now. I backed up another step, keeping my light on them. My truck was just a few feet away. If I could get to it, get inside, grab my rifle. Then the figure turned. Not quickly, slowly, deliberately, and walked back into the trees. I watched until the darkness swallowed them completely. Then I ran. I grabbed my gear, tossed it in the truck without packing it properly. The fire was still burning as I jumped into the driver's seat and locked the doors. I didn't wait. I started the engine, threw it into reverse, and backed out of there so fast I nearly hit a tree. My tires kicked up dirt as I turned onto the narrow trail, heading back the way I came. I checked my mirrors. Nothing, but I didn't stop. I drove through the night, not slowing down until I hit the main road miles away. Only then did I pull over, my hands shaking on the wheel, my heart still pounding. I didn't go back. I never went back. I don't know who was out there, and I don't want to know. It started as a simple plan. My gym partner, Kevin, and I had been talking about getting outside more, doing something different from our usual workouts. We had been lifting weights together for almost 2 years, pushing each other to new personal bests, spotting each other on heavy sets, and keeping each other accountable. but we had both realized that our fitness routines had become repetitive. Gym, protein shakes, work, sleep, repeat. Kevin was the one who brought up camping. He had done a bit of it in the past, said he wanted to get back into it. I hadn't camped since I was a kid, but the idea of spending a weekend out in nature, away from everything, sounded good. I figured it would be a nice way to challenge ourselves in a different way. Hiking, chopping wood, setting up camp, cooking out in the open. Something different from the usual. We decided on a place a few hours away, deep in the mountains. It wasn't a touristy area. No campgrounds with families or RVs. Just miles of thick trees, dirt roads, and a few small lakes scattered throughout. Kevin had some gear, an old tent, sleeping bags, a couple of hunting knives, and a hatchet. I went out and bought a new backpack, a water filter, and some other basic supplies. Neither of us was an expert, but we weren't complete idiots either. The drive up was long, the roads getting rougher as we got deeper into the mountains. The last stretch was nothing but dirt and gravel, winding up and down hills, with no signs of civilization. The last house we had passed was at least an hour behind us. There were no power lines, no street signs, just trees and more trees. We finally reached the spot Kevin had in mind. A small clearing near a lake, surrounded by dense forest. The place was dead quiet. No traffic, no distant hum of city life. Just the occasional chirp of birds and the rustling of leaves when the wind picked up. We set up our tent near the tree line, close enough to the water to make filtering it easy, but far enough that we weren't right on the shore. The first few hours were great. We gathered wood, built a fire, cooked some food, and just enjoyed being out there. The sun was setting by the time we finished eating, and the temperature was dropping fast. That's something I hadn't really thought about. How quickly it gets cold when you're out in the middle of nowhere, away from concrete and pavement, holding on to the heat of the day. Kevin and I sat by the fire, talking about random stuff, our workouts, our jobs, people we knew. It was nice to just sit there and not worry about anything. But even then, there was something about the silence that felt different. Like it wasn't just quiet, it was too quiet. No insects buzzing, no owls hooting, no distant sounds of animals moving through the trees. Just the crackling of the fire and nothing else. I didn't say anything about it. I figured maybe I was just too used to the background noise of the city, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was around midnight when we decided to call it a night. The fire had died down, leaving behind a pile of glowing embers. We crawled into the tent, zipped up our sleeping bags, and tried to get some sleep. First, everything was fine. The air was cold, but I was warm in my sleeping bag. The ground was uncomfortable, but I expected that. I was just starting to drift off when I heard something. Footsteps. Not animal footsteps. These were slow, deliberate human footsteps. I opened my eyes, staring up at the dark fabric of the tent. I wasn't sure if I had really heard something or if my brain was just playing tricks on me. I held my breath, listening. There it was again. Crunch, crunch. Leaves and twigs breaking underfoot. Close, too close. I turned my head toward Kevin. He wasn't moving, but I could tell he was awake. His breathing had changed, short, shallow breaths, like he was listening too. I didn't want to move. I didn't want to make a sound, but my heart was pounding so hard I felt like it was shaking my whole body. The footsteps stopped, right outside the tent. I could feel the presence of something or someone, just beyond the thin layer of fabric separating us from the outside world. Then came the worst part, the breathing. Slow, heavy, deep. Whoever or whatever it was, they were just standing there, breathing, not moving, just standing. Kevin's hand moved slightly toward the knife he had brought. I could see the outline of his fingers gripping the handle. We stayed like that for what felt like forever. The breathing continued, slow, steady. Then, finally, the footsteps started again, moving away from the tent. We waited. 5 minutes, 10, 15, nothing, just silence again. Kevin finally moved, unzipping the tent as quietly as he could. He peeked out, then slowly crawled outside. I followed. The fire was completely out. The air was freezing. We grabbed our flashlights and swept the area around the tent. And then we saw them. Footprints. Deep, clear footprints in the dirt, circling our tent. Not boots, bare feet, and they weren't small. I felt my stomach drop. This wasn't just some lost hiker. This wasn't an animal. This was someone watching us. Kevin and I looked at each other. Neither of us said a word. We just started packing. Fast. We tore down the tent, threw everything into our packs, and grabbed our knives. We didn't even bother tying things down properly. We just wanted to get out of there. The hike back to the truck was brutal. The trail was dark, uneven, and filled with roots and rocks that kept trying to trip us up. Every few minutes, we stopped listening. We didn't hear anything, but we couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. When we finally reached the truck, Kevin practically jumped into the driver's seat while I threw our bags into the back. The moment the engine roared to life, he slammed the gas, and we tore out of there, speeding down the dirt road like our lives depended on it. And maybe they did. We didn't stop driving until we were miles away, back on paved roads, surrounded by streetlights and other cars. Only then did we finally take a breath. We never talked about it after that. Not really. We went back to our normal lives, back to the gym, back to our routines. But we never went camping again. And I still think about that night, about the footprints, about the breathing, and about the fact that whoever it was, they never ran. They never made a sound. They just stood there, watching, waiting,